Hello everyone, and welcome to a different kind of video for me. I'm going to make a quick beginner's guide to Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, kind of give you a watch order and a general background, because there's some things that is nice to know before you go in. Started off, Game of Thrones and House of the Dragons are based off a series of books by George R. R. Martin. I won't get into the specifics of the books, because I think a lot of people are going to watch the show before they would read the books. But generally, it's medieval fantasy with a lot of some magical elements and dragons, obviously. It's a very political show, but in a way that doesn't feel stale. It's not modern day politics. It's not legislation. If something does something wrong, you kind of just deal with it immediately. Your head gets chopped off, you get burned, one of the two. So it's a lot more interesting than that. As for a watch order, definitely, in my opinion, watch Game of Thrones before House of the Dragon. While House of the Dragon takes place 170 years before Game of Thrones, I feel like House of the Dragon sometimes assumes you've already seen Game of Thrones. So when they mention other houses and places in the world, they assume you kind of have a general idea in your head or a map in your head of where they're at. They kind of take some liberties assuming people have seen the other show. You can absolutely watch House of the Dragon first, but I think it also ruins a little bit of the spectacle of Game of Thrones. This is completely spoiler free, but there's things that happen in Game of Thrones that I think seeing all the dragons and all the things that happen in House of the Dragon would kind of take away from that spectacle and that excitement. So while you can, I would recommend watching Game of Thrones first. So the second thing I think will be helpful is some background knowledge and just the general map of Westeros. I'll put a map of Westeros, the Seven Kingdoms. That's where you'll spend the majority of your time here. There's a bunch of different kingdoms, all the way from the Wall up north to Dorne in the south. But it's nice to have a visual of the map so you have a general idea of where they're at. Because when they move, you sometimes don't see travel and they don't really show a lot of maps. So you can get kind of lost on where they're at and where this relates. So I think it's nice to have like a landmark and just a general base in geography. And then two events specifically I think you should know about. I'm going to go over them very, very loosely and generally because this is a beginner's guide and you can always dive more deep into this, but just the general knowledge is, so House Targaryen united the Seven Kingdoms coming from Valyria, which is another continent separate from Westeros. Aegon and his two sisters, which were also his wives, conquered all seven kingdoms and united them under one general rule. That's one thing you need to know, and then they had multiple dragons. Dragons were common tale over like 100 years ago before Game of Thrones. You saw a lot of different dragons, and it wasn't as surprising, but by the time of Game of Thrones, all of the dragons are gone. The second thing to know about is Robert's Rebellion. The king, when the show starts, is King Robert Baratheon, and his rebellion to reclaim the Seven Kingdoms from the Targaryen dynasty. One king had gone mad, and his rebellion completely shuffled how Westeros works. The Targaryens were no more, and the realm basically started over again without their crown family. So those are two topics that are good to know before you go into it. And just generally speaking, try to separate storylines in your mind. Some of my friends who've watched Game of Thrones have got lost at the beginning because there are a lot of different storylines to follow. They don't all work in the same parallel. They'll work away from each other and come back in. They all unite at points and they all make sense in the end. But do your best to separate storylines in your head and try not to get lost. So remember who's with who and who's where, because the first season or two of this, you definitely follow a lot of different paths at the same time. And why I didn't have a problem with it, I know a couple people who did, so that's something to watch out for. And the last thing I want to mention today, if you really want to get into Game of Thrones and kind of have that knowledge, the show of Game of Thrones only covers Robert's Rebellion and on. There's hundreds of years of history and writings and other things going on, so there's no way you're going to know everything. I would just go in with an open mind and try to keep your characters straight and your houses straight. But if you were interested in knowing more before Game of Thrones, there's books like this, which is more just like a history of Game of Thrones, and kind of like it animates it, so it's more fun to look at. It's not just a wall of text, because starting with the books can be a lot. They're really long, there's a lot of them, and they vary from the show. There'll be characters that exist in the book that aren't even mentioned in the show at all. So there's two books. The first one was World of Ice and Fire, just a general overview, and then we have this one that just came out. This is more focused solely on the Targaryen dynasty. I think this takes up to just after House of the Dragons. So this one, if you don't want spoilers for the show, I would probably hold off on the second one, just because while they've already deviated from the books, I would imagine the general plot points are probably going to stay very similar. So I would definitely make the decision beforehand. Are you going to read the books and know what happens in the show, or are you going to wait till after the show? I recommend waiting till after the show because Game of Thrones has some of the most shocking moments of any show I've ever watched. So there's a lot you can be surprised of, and I wouldn't ruin that with the books if I were you. So that's a really brief beginner's guide to Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. I don't want to go too much deeper, and I wouldn't recommend going much deeper because Game of Thrones as a series has some of the best twists and turns and surprise moments, and if you don't already know them, they're very amazing to experience for yourself. So do your best to avoid spoilers, and let me know what you think if you start watching. And if you're interested in more House of the Dragons and Game of Thrones content, please subscribe to my channel. I plan on posting much more, and thank you for watching.